Sometimes people don't have to say you're unwanted. I realized that afternoon. They just have to show you where they think you belong. I still remember the sound of my grandson Ethan's laughter floating across the backyard as I stepped through the side gate carrying his birthday present in both hands. The wrapping paper had tiny baseballs printed across it because he'd been obsessed with Little League ever since spring started. And tucked inside the box was the vintage glove I had spent 3 weekends restoring just for him. I'd even stitched his initials into the leather myself. The smell of charcoal smoke and vanilla cake drifted through the warm June air while children ran across the grass with juice boxes in their hands. Bright blue balloons bounced gently against the wooden fence, and someone had music playing softly near the patio. For a moment, standing there in my pale green cardigan with my casserole dish balanced against my hip, I thought maybe this would finally feel like family again. "Grandma!" Ethan shouted the second he spotted me. He ran toward me so fast one of his sneakers nearly slipped off his heel. I smiled so hard my cheeks hurt as I bent down carefully to hug him. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I whispered into his hair. "I brought you something special." Before he could answer, Heather appeared beside the patio table holding a tray of cupcakes. Her smile arrived first, smooth and practiced, the kind people use when company is watching. "Margaret," she said lightly, "you made it." I noticed she didn't lean in for a hug. "Of course I did," I answered quietly. "I wouldn't miss Ethan's birthday." "Great," she replied, glancing over her shoulder toward the guests gathered beneath the white party tent. "We're a little crowded today, so your seat's over there." At first I thought she meant one of the folding chairs near the dessert table. Then a teenage boy helping with decorations pointed toward the far corner of the yard beside the wooden fence. My chair sat alone next to 2 large green trash cans with black lids half open from people tossing away paper plates. One of them already had a garbage bag overflowing with crumpled napkins and soda cups. For a second, I honestly believed there had been some mistake. I looked back toward the long family tables covered with bright birthday decorations, where everyone else sat laughing together beneath strings of lights. Then I looked again at the single metal chair beside the trash cans, sitting under the hot afternoon sun like it had been placed there on purpose. I stood there holding Ethan's gift while the sounds of the party continued around me as if nothing unusual had happened at all. A little girl ran past carrying a paper plate stacked with potato chips, and somewhere near the patio somebody laughed loudly over a story I could not hear. The normalness of it all somehow made the chair look even worse. Heather adjusted the tray in her hands and gave me another polished smile. "We had a bigger turnout than expected," she said casually. "I hope that spot is okay." For a moment I could not find my voice. I glanced again toward the tables under the tent. Daniel sat near the center beside Heather's parents, already deep in conversation with one of the neighbors. There were empty chairs near them. I counted 3 without even trying. My son looked up briefly and our eyes met for less than a second before he looked away again. That hurt more than the chair itself. Ethan reached for my hand. "Grandma, come open my present with me." Before I could answer, Heather stepped in gently. "Sweetheart, let Grandma get settled first, okay?" The words sounded kind enough that nobody nearby would think twice about them, but I noticed the way her eyes flicked toward the trash cans as she said it, like she wanted to make sure I understood exactly where I belonged today. I forced a smile onto my face because 8-year-old boys should not have to carry the weight of grown adults behaving badly. "It is all right, honey," I told Ethan softly. "Go play with your friends first." He hesitated before running back toward the bounce house. I slowly walked across the yard, every step feeling strangely heavy despite the warm grass beneath my sandals. The closer I got to the chair, the stronger the smell became. Sour soda, hamburger grease, sun-heated garbage bags. Somebody had wedged a broken pool noodle between the bins, and flies buzzed lazily around the lids. I carefully placed my casserole dish on my lap and sat down in the metal chair while conversations continued behind me. Nobody stopped me. Nobody said, "Margaret, sit over here instead." A woman from the neighborhood glanced at me with obvious discomfort before quickly turning back to her husband. I looked down at my pale green cardigan and suddenly felt foolish for spending an hour curling my hair that morning. Then I heard Heather's voice drifting across the yard again. "Make sure we save the seats near the cake table for close family," she told someone. I sat perfectly still after that, staring at the children playing in the sunshine while the word close echoed quietly in my chest. I tried to focus on Ethan instead of the burning embarrassment creeping up my neck. He was chasing Bubbles near the inflatable slide now, laughing so hard that his entire face lit up the way Daniel's used to when he was little. Watching him should have made me happy. Instead, I sat there painfully aware of every person who glanced toward me and then quickly looked away. The trash can beside my chair rattled every time someone tossed in another paper plate. A teenage girl dropped a half-melted popsicle into it and gave me an awkward smile afterward, as though she suddenly realized I was sitting close enough to hear the sticky splat hit the garbage bag. "You doing okay over here, Margaret?" one of Daniel's neighbors asked while passing by with a beer in his hand. His voice carried the careful politeness people use when they already know the answer. "I am just fine," I replied with a smile that felt stiff on my face. He nodded too quickly before hurrying back toward the patio. Nobody stayed longer than a few seconds near my chair. It was as if the trash cans created some invisible wall between me and the rest of the party. I watched Heather moving gracefully from table to table greeting guests, touching shoulders, laughing at jokes, making sure everyone had enough food. She looked perfect in her white summer dress, the picture of a warm suburban mother hosting a beautiful birthday party. Every now and then her eyes drifted toward me, checking whether I was still quietly sitting where she had placed me. Daniel finally walked over about 20 minutes later, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Hey Mom," he said softly. "You all right?" I looked up at my son, really looked at him. His hair had started graying near the temples recently, and for a second I saw the tired little boy I used to rock to sleep after thunderstorms. "Daniel," I asked gently, "did you know where Heather put my chair?" His face tightened almost immediately. Not surprise. Not confusion. Guilt. He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward the party before lowering his voice. "Mom, it is just seating. Please do not make this into something bigger today." Something inside me went painfully quiet after that. Not shattered. Not angry. Just quiet. Because the worst part was realizing he already knew. He had seen the chair beside the garbage cans and decided his mother sitting there was less uncomfortable than disagreeing with his wife. Before I could answer him, Heather called out cheerfully from across the yard. "Daniel, we are doing cake pictures." He gave me one apologetic look before turning away. And then while everyone gathered near the giant blue birthday cake under the decorated tent, I realized nobody had asked me to come join the family photo. The photographer Heather hired clapped her hands loudly near the cake table, while parents gathered their children together beneath the white tent. "Okay, everybody, family first," she called with a cheerful smile. I remained sitting beside the trash cans, waiting for someone to wave me over. Surely nobody would intentionally leave Ethan's grandmother out of the birthday pictures. I watched Daniel stand beside Heather with one hand resting on Ethan's shoulder, while Heather's parents moved into place beside them. Ethan scanned the yard for a second before his face brightened when he spotted me in the corner. He lifted his arm to wave. "Grandma!" he shouted. My heart immediately softened at the sound of his voice. I started to rise from the metal chair, smoothing my cardigan as carefully as I could. Then Heather leaned down toward Ethan and quietly adjusted the collar of his baseball shirt. I could not hear every word from that distance, but I saw her smile and gently guide his attention back toward the camera. Ethan hesitated for a moment before turning around again. The photographer lifted her camera. "Everybody closer together," she said. "Perfect family." The words settled heavily in my chest. Perfect family. I slowly lowered myself back into the chair while flashes from the camera lit up the backyard. Nobody called my name. Nobody noticed the empty space where I should have been standing. Or maybe they noticed and simply chose silence because silence was easier. I folded my hands tightly in my lap and stared down at the casserole dish I had brought that morning. The aluminum tray had already gone cold beneath the afternoon heat. A gust of wind pushed the sour smell from the trash cans toward me again, and I suddenly felt foolish for still sitting there at all. Near the dessert table, Heather laughed brightly at something one of the guests said while Daniel kept glancing around like a man desperate not to look directly at a problem standing in front of him. Then Ethan suddenly broke away from the group and ran across the grass toward me. "Grandma," he asked breathlessly, "why are you sitting over here by the garbage?" The entire world seemed to go still for one terrible second. A few nearby conversations faded into awkward silence. Even children know when something feels wrong. I forced another smile because I refused to let an 8-year-old carry the shame adults created. "Oh, sweetheart," I said gently, brushing hair away from his forehead. "Grandma just needed a quiet place to sit." Ethan frowned and looked back toward the tables. "But there are chairs over there." Before I could answer him, Heather appeared beside us holding a plastic knife for the birthday cake. Her smile never slipped. "Ethan, honey, everyone is waiting for you." Then she glanced down at me and added softly, "Margaret has always liked her space." Heather rested her hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder and steered him back toward the cake table before he could ask another question. I watched my grandson glance over his shoulder at me one last time, confusion written plainly across his small face. Children notice things adults spend entire lifetimes pretending not to see. The photographer began singing along as everyone gathered around the giant blue cake, covered in white frosting baseballs. "Okay, everybody," she called brightly. Big smiles for Ethan. The crowd joined in singing happy birthday while I remained alone beside the fence with the smell of warm garbage drifting through the air. I quietly folded my hands together and tried not to let my expression change. After 67 years of life, I had learned there are humiliations you survive by becoming very still. Ethan blew out his candles while cheers erupted around the tables. Heather immediately began handing slices of cake to guests, carefully making her way through the crowd with practiced charm. Plates passed from hand to hand. Ice cream cups disappeared. Children laughed with frosting smeared across their cheeks. Nearly 10 minutes went by before anyone approached me. A teenage cousin finally wandered over carrying 2 paper plates. "I think this one is yours," she said awkwardly before placing a melting slice of cake onto my lap beside the casserole dish. The frosting had already slid sideways from the heat. "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied softly. She gave me a quick sympathetic smile before hurrying away again. I stared down at the cake but suddenly had no appetite at all. Then I noticed something strange. Heather had seated her parents beside Daniel at the center table. Her sister and brother-in-law sat nearby under the shaded tent with pitchers of lemonade and decorative party favors placed in front of them. Even neighbors had proper seats together. Only me. Only Ethan's grandmother sat beside trash cans like an afterthought somebody forgot to hide. And once I saw it clearly, other moments from the past year suddenly began lining up in my mind one after another like dominoes finally falling into place. Thanksgiving dinner moved to Heather's sister's house at the last minute without anyone telling me until the morning of. Christmas photos posted online before I even knew they had gathered. Fewer phone calls. Shorter visits. Excuses every time I offered to babysit Ethan. "We are keeping things small. We already made plans. You do not need to drive all this way." At the time I told myself families simply got busy. But sitting there beside those garbage bins, hearing laughter drift across a backyard where I no longer seemed welcome, I realized something much colder. This was not one careless decision. This had been happening slowly for a very long time. And somehow I had spent months convincing myself not to see it. The sun had started lowering behind the houses by the time people began drifting toward the drink table for coffee and leftovers. Children were chasing each other through the yard with half-deflated balloons, while adults settled into quieter conversations beneath the tent. I remained in the same metal chair, though by then my back ached from sitting so stiffly for hours. The slice of birthday cake still rested untouched beside me, the frosting beginning to melt against the paper plate. At some point I realized nobody had noticed I never ate it. I picked up the casserole dish from my lap and decided I should at least bring it inside before heading home. Maybe if I quietly left it in the kitchen, I could slip out afterward without creating an uncomfortable goodbye. I walked carefully across the yard while conversations floated around me like I was invisible. Near the patio doors, Heather stood speaking with 2 women from the neighborhood while pouring iced tea into plastic cups. I lowered my eyes slightly, intending to pass by unnoticed, but then one of the women laughed softly and said, "You are brave. I could never host my mother-in-law all the time like that." Heather gave a small dramatic sigh before answering, "Honestly, Daniel would feel guilty if I did not invite her." The women chuckled politely. My footsteps slowed without meaning to. Heather continued stirring ice cubes through her drink with the little plastic spoon. "She means well," she said smoothly. But she just does not fit the kind of gatherings we usually have anymore. Something cold settled into my stomach. One of the women glanced awkwardly toward the yard. Still putting. Her all the way back there seemed a little. She did not finish the sentence. Heather only shrugged. Margaret likes quiet spaces and honestly, she gets sensitive around crowds. This arrangement keeps things easier for everybody. Easier for everybody. I stood perfectly still behind the patio wall listening to strangers discuss me like I was an inconvenient decoration nobody knew where to place. Then Heather lowered her voice slightly, though not enough. Besides, she added with a soft laugh, if I let her sit at the main table, she acts like she is still the center of the family. The women laughed again, quieter this time. Not cruel exactly. Just uncomfortable enough to let her continue. I looked down at my hands gripping the casserole dish so tightly my knuckles had turned pale. Suddenly every ignored phone call, every delayed invitation, every polite excuse over the last year felt painfully clear. This had never been accidental. Heather had been slowly moving me farther and farther out of their lives while making it look graceful enough that nobody could openly criticize her for it. And Daniel had allowed it because pretending not to notice was easier than standing beside his own mother. I backed away from the patio before anyone realized I had heard a single word. I returned to my chair beside the fence, but something inside me had changed during those few minutes near the patio. Earlier in the afternoon I had still been trying to explain things away. I told myself Heather was stressed from hosting. I told myself Daniel was distracted. I told myself families sometimes become careless without meaning to. But after hearing her words with my own ears, the confusion disappeared completely. The humiliation had been intentional, carefully arranged, soft enough to remain socially acceptable, but sharp enough to remind me exactly where she believed I belonged. I sat down slowly and looked across the backyard one final time. The white party tent glowed beneath the late afternoon sun while guests laughed over cups of coffee and leftover cake. Children chased each other across the lawn with plastic baseball bats. From a distance it looked like the kind of happy family gathering people post online with captions about gratitude and togetherness. Nobody looking at that backyard would notice the grandmother sitting alone beside two garbage bins. Or maybe they would notice and simply decide it was not their business. I suddenly felt very tired. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just tired in a deep and quiet way I had never experienced before. I picked up the untouched slice of birthday cake and carefully set it on top of the trash can lid. Then I lifted Ethan's gift from beside my chair. At least he had loved that part of the afternoon. Before leaving, I walked toward the front yard to say goodbye to him. Ethan spotted me near the driveway and immediately ran over holding a blue balloon by its string. "Grandma, are you leaving already?" he asked, slightly out of breath. I smiled gently and crouched down enough to kiss his forehead. "I think Grandma is getting a little tired, sweetheart." He frowned. "But you did not even open presents with us yet." For one dangerous second I almost told him the truth. I almost told him his grandmother spent his birthday party sitting beside trash cans, while the rest of the family laughed under a shaded tent. But children deserve innocence for as long as the world allows it. "You have had a big day already," I told him softly instead. "I had a wonderful time seeing you happy." Heather appeared on the porch steps then, waving with the same polished smile she had worn all afternoon. "Thanks for coming, Margaret," she called out brightly, as though I had simply attended a lovely gathering like everyone else. Daniel stood behind her holding a stack of empty paper plates. He opened his mouth slightly when he saw me leaving, but whatever words tried to form there disappeared before they reached his lips. I nodded once toward both of them. Calm, polite, dignified. Then I turned toward my car without another word. As I drove away from the neighborhood with the evening sun burning orange across the windshield, I realized something painful and freeing at the exact same time. You can spend years begging quietly for a place in someone's life before finally understanding they already chose where they wanted you to sit. The drive home felt much longer than 40 minutes that evening. The roads were quiet, washed gold by the setting sun, while old songs played softly through the car radio without me hearing a single lyric. My hand stayed steady on the steering wheel, but inside my chest something heavy kept pressing deeper and deeper with every mile. I had spent years telling myself family difficulties were temporary things. Misunderstandings, stress, busy schedules. But humiliation changes shape once you finally stop explaining it away. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had turned dusky purple above the maple trees lining my street. My little white house looked exactly the same as always, neat flower pots near the porch steps, wind chimes swaying gently near the front window, but for the first time in years it no longer felt lonely when I unlocked the door. It felt peaceful. I carried Ethan's empty together. $40,000. Nearly every extra dollar we had managed to save before he passed away. It is family, I told Daniel back then when he cried and promised to pay me back someday. Families help each other. I slowly sat down at the kitchen table now, staring at the dark window above the sink. Funny how differently people define family once they no longer need something from you. My eyes drifted toward the small filing cabinet near the hallway where I kept old financial records and legal papers. For a moment I just sat there listening to the grandfather clock tick softly through the quiet house. Then, without fully knowing why, I stood up and walked toward the cabinet. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, and the familiar smell of old paper and dust rose into the quiet kitchen air. Inside were years of carefully labeled folders organized in my own handwriting. Tax records, insurance forms, mortgage documents, hospital bills from when Robert got sick. I knelt slowly beside the cabinet, running my fingers across faded tabs while the grandfather clock continued ticking steadily in the hallway. It felt strange how a normal evening could quietly divide your life into before and after without warning. Finally, I found the folder labeled Whitmore House. The edges were worn from years of handling. I carried it back to the kitchen table and sat beneath the soft yellow light over the stove. For several minutes I simply stared at it without opening it at all. Then I slid the papers out carefully across the table. Loan agreements, wire transfer receipts, copies of cashier's checks. I found the document from 7 years earlier showing the exact amount I transferred into Daniel and Heather's joint account for their down payment. $40,000. Nearly every savings bond Robert and I had spent decades building together. My chest tightened slightly as I remembered Daniel hugging me at this very table after I handed him the paperwork. "Mom," he had whispered back then with tears in his eyes, "I swear I will never forget this." I let out a slow breath and continued sorting through the folder. Then I noticed another document tucked beneath. The mortgage records that I had not looked at in years. My name. I blinked once and pulled the paper closer beneath the light. When the bank approved Daniel and Heather's mortgage, my financial contribution had been large enough that the attorney handling the closing recommended adding a limited ownership protection clause tied to the original down payment. At the time, Daniel insisted it was only a formality to protect my investment. I barely thought about it afterward because I trusted my son completely. But now, reading the language carefully line by line, I realized something important. The agreement gave me partial legal interest connected to the property until the original amount had been formally repaid or refinanced through specific documentation. I sat back slowly in my chair. Over the years, Daniel occasionally mentioned refinancing the house, but no final paperwork had ever been signed in front of me, which meant the agreement might still be active. Outside the kitchen window, crickets had begun chirping softly in the dark while neighborhood porch lights flickered on one by one. I stared down at the paper spread across the table and suddenly remembered Heather's voice from earlier that afternoon. "She acts like she is still the center of the family." A sad little smile crossed my face then, though it carried no warmth. Funny thing about being treated like an outsider. Sometimes people forget how much of the foundation you quietly built beneath them before they ever started pretending you no longer belong there. 3 weeks passed after Ethan's birthday party, and during that time I stopped doing something I had spent years forcing myself to do. I stopped reaching out first. No phone calls asking whether they needed groceries. No texts reminding Daniel about doctor appointments. No offers to babysit Ethan on weekends. I simply stepped back quietly and let the silence settle where my effort used to be. First, nothing happened. Days passed peacefully inside my small white house. I watered my roses in the mornings, read mystery novels in the afternoons, took long walks through the neighborhood at sunset without constantly checking my phone. Slowly, the ache inside my chest stopped feeling sharp and became something calmer. Acceptance, perhaps. Then one rainy Thursday evening, my phone rang while I was folding laundry in the living room. Daniel's name appeared across the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. Hi, Mom, he said quickly, sounding unusually nervous. Are you busy? I folded another towel carefully before responding. No, Daniel. What is wrong? There was a pause long enough for me to hear him exhale. We actually need to talk to you about something. Of course they did. I remained quiet while rain tapped softly against the windows. The bank found an issue during our refinancing paperwork, he continued. Apparently there is still some old ownership protection agreement connected to the house. I closed my eyes briefly. I know, I answered calmly. Another silence followed. Longer this time. You knew? He asked carefully. I signed the documents too, Daniel. His voice tightened with embarrassment. Right. Of course. I could almost picture him rubbing the back of his neck the same way he always did when uncomfortable. Then Heather's voice suddenly appeared faintly in the background, asking something I could not fully hear. Daniel lowered his tone. The lender says we need your signature to finalize everything. There it was at last. Not concern. Not apology. Need. I walked slowly toward the kitchen window while holding the phone against my ear. Outside, rainwater slid down the glass in thin silver lines beneath the porch light. I see, I said softly. Daniel rushed ahead quickly after that. It is really just paperwork, Mom. We thought maybe you could come by this weekend and sign everything. We thought maybe you could come by. I almost smiled at the sudden politeness wrapped around convenience. How is Ethan? I asked instead. Daniel hesitated slightly, clearly caught off guard by the question. He is good. Soccer season started. That is nice. Another awkward silence settled between us. Then finally, very quietly, Daniel spoke again. Mom, are you still upset about the birthday party? I looked out into the rain for several seconds before answering him. Daniel, I said gently. People reveal what they truly think of you by where they choose to place you when nobody is watching themselves. He did not respond after that. Because deep down my son already knew exactly what I meant. Daniel and Heather arrived that Sunday afternoon exactly at 2 o'clock carrying a thick folder of refinancing paperwork and expressions so carefully polite they almost looked rehearsed. I opened the front door wearing a soft blue sweater and invited them inside with the same calm courtesy I had shown strangers my entire adult life. Heather held a bakery box in both hands. We brought cinnamon rolls from that place you like, she said brightly. The sudden thoughtfulness almost would have been convincing if I had not spent the previous month learning exactly how conditional their kindness could become. That was thoughtful, I replied gently while stepping aside. Daniel looked uncomfortable the moment he entered the house. His eyes drifted around the familiar living room filled with framed family photographs, many of them from years before Heather ever entered our lives. Pictures of camping trips, Christmas mornings, Ethan asleep on my chest as a baby while I rocked him in this very room so his exhausted parents could rest upstairs. Heather sat at the dining table and immediately began arranging paperwork into neat little stacks. The lender says everything should move quickly once these forms are signed, she explained smoothly. Businesslike. Efficient. Not one mention of the birthday party. Not one apology. Daniel finally cleared his throat. Mom, he began carefully. About a few weeks ago. I raised my hand gently before he could continue. There is no need to force uncomfortable conversations if you are only having them because you need something from me. Silence dropped heavily across the table. Heather lowered her eyes toward the paperwork while Daniel stared down at his folded hands. For several seconds, the only sound came from the grandfather clock ticking softly near the hallway. Then Heather spoke in a quieter voice than I had ever heard from her before. Margaret, if your feelings were hurt that day, I truly did not intend for things to come across that way. I looked at her calmly. Your intentions were very clear. Her face flushed slightly. Daniel leaned forward quickly. Mom, please. We are trying to fix this. I studied my son carefully then. The gray near his temples looked more noticeable under the afternoon light. Suddenly he seemed exhausted in a way deeper than paperwork or mortgage stress. Tired from years of avoiding difficult truths because avoidance always felt easier than honesty. I folded my hands together neatly on the table. Do you know what hurt most? I asked softly. Neither of them answered. It was not the chair. Their eyes lifted toward me immediately. It was realizing my son saw exactly where I had been placed and decided saying nothing was more convenient than standing beside me. Daniel's face tightened with shame. Heather remained very still beside him. I let the silence settle for a moment before speaking again. Calm, steady, certain. You already chose my place in your family that afternoon, I said quietly. Now you suddenly need my signature because the bank reminded you I still exist. I did sign the paperwork that afternoon, but not before making one thing very clear. I calmly requested a formal repayment agreement for the original $40,000 Robert and I had invested in their home all those years ago. No raised voices. No dramatic threats. Just boundaries written neatly on paper where everyone could finally see them. Heather looked stunned when I slid the document across the dining table. Daniel looked ashamed. But neither of them argued because deep down they both knew I had every right to ask for it. After they left that evening, the house felt quiet again, though no longer empty. Something inside me had settled into place for the first time in years. I stopped measuring my worth by invitations that arrived out of obligation or smiles that disappeared the moment I became inconvenient. A few days later, Ethan called me from Daniel's phone while I was planting flowers in the front yard. "Grandma," he asked excitedly, "can I come over Saturday?" The sound of his voice softened something inside me immediately. "I would love that, sweetheart." That Saturday morning, Ethan arrived carrying his baseball glove and an overnight bag nearly bigger than he was. I spent the afternoon teaching him how to make homemade pancakes while flour dust covered half my kitchen counters. We watched an old baseball movie together in the living room while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. Later that evening, Ethan sat beside me on the porch swing, eating vanilla ice cream straight from the bowl. "Grandma?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sweetheart." He stared out toward the darkening street for a moment before speaking again. "I did not like where they put your chair at my birthday party. Children always remember the moments adults hope they will forget." I brushed my fingers gently through his hair. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," I answered softly. Ethan looked up at me carefully. "Did it hurt your feelings?" For a second, I considered giving him the kind of polite answer adults usually hide behind. But children deserve honesty spoken gently. "Yes," I admitted quietly. "A little." He nodded thoughtfully, then leaned his head against my shoulder. "Well," he said after a moment, "next year you can sit next to me." My throat tightened unexpectedly at those simple words. Not because they fixed what happened. Nothing could erase the humiliation of that afternoon beside the trash cans. But because kindness offered sincerely by a child felt more genuine than all the polished smiles and forced politeness adults hide behind. I wrapped my arm carefully around Ethan while the porch swing creaked softly beneath us. And as the warm porch light glowed across the quiet yard, I realized something important. Family is not the table where people reluctantly allow you to sit. Family is the place where your presence is welcomed before you even arrive.